Anyway, let's talk about Gorgias. So this was not the easiest reading, I assume, in the world. I know it's not the easiest reading in the world. I gave you a heavily abridged version. It's one of the most important Platonic Socratic dialogues, but admittedly, there's a lot of stuff in it that I think can be fast-forwarded right through without losing a huge amount. So I tried to do that for you. Partially an abridgment from a textbook, partially my own abridgment. I tried to give you the most important stuff from it, but I did miss some important things, certainly. Any abridgment misses something important. And there's one important thing that I realized I did abridge out, but that I wanted to talk about briefly, and it pertains to the very first question on your discussion sheet. And I'll put it on the board as well. To refute or to be refuted? And the question, of course, is which is better? We touched on a similar question earlier, but I like to share, some years ago I was teaching a class of 12th grade young men, and you can just take that discussion sheet right there. And I happened to be talking about Gorgias with my philosophy classes here at that same general time, and I just figured for the heck of it, I'd ask them. Again, these were just a group of high school young men. I asked them, so which is better? To refute or to be refuted? What do you think they said? To refute. Why? Why do you suppose that was their answer? If you refute, it's like you've what? It's like you won, right? It's like you dominated. It's like dominating in sports almost, showing your prowess off, showing how awesome you are, destroying others. As you see on YouTube all the time, some pundit, the title is always like, this person destroys this other person, as if that's something to rejoice over, someone being destroyed. So I wager we ought not rejoice over anyone being destroyed, but certainly let me not say certainly. Let me ask you guys, because this wasn't in the part I had you read. Socrates and Gorgias themselves talk about this. They talk about which is better, to refute or to be refuted. They're actually, ironically, having this discussion in the midst of a dialogue where there's much refutation going on, but what do you suppose Socrates says is better? To be refuted. Absolutely. And here's the great thing. Socrates and Gorgias agree on that. They both agree. You know what? It is better to be refuted. If only people could settle that from the onset of every dialogue they enter into, there would be so much less vitriol, so much less ideology, and so much more accomplished. Because if you refute, what have you gained from that? Nothing. If you are refuted, what have you gained from that? What's that? It's like more stuff to argue or like counter. Certainly, okay. That's one way of you could, through that being refuted, if you still nevertheless want to stick to your view, you've at least, hopefully you, upon further reflection, realize why you were erroneously refuted, but you've been given more counterpoints to consider. That was one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is if you are refuted, you've been cured of error. To be refuted is to be cured of error. To refute is to gain nothing other than a pointless boost to your own ego, which is boosting our own ego is not really good for ourselves anyway. So to be refuted is better, certainly. Socrates and Gorgias agree. This entails being cured of error. You've missed out on an opportunity to dominate someone, though. And so what? What glory is there in dominating and destroying other people? There's no glory in that. But you've been cured of error. So, do we want to be cured of error, though? Is ignorance bliss? That's what they say, but it's not. Ignorance is not bliss. That's the thing. If you believe that your brakes work, hopefully you're right, but maybe you're not. Maybe somebody's in the parking garage right now cutting your brake lines, and maybe somebody else is observing this happen. And if this person observing it happen approaches you on your way back to your car and refutes your belief that your brakes work, you are obviously, I hope, going to be very grateful for that, because you've been cured of error, and error is not this isolated little thing that just happily resides in your mind without hurting anybody. Error is the most harmful thing in the world. It is not bliss. It does not reside there in some intellectual realm by itself. It causes damage. Think about how much blood, sweat, and tears it takes to be cured of error the hard way, which is the only way many of us will allow ourselves to be cured of error. And I am no exception, unfortunately, to this general norm. Learning a lesson the hard way, what does that mean? When someone says, okay, you're going to have to learn it the hard way, what do they mean when they say that? You're going to have to follow your erroneous views on whatever the question is and deal with what? Consequences. You're going to crash and burn. And we've all, let's be honest, it's happened to all of us plenty of times. And then we learn our lesson the hard way. And it takes a lot of time and, again, toil, misery. But it doesn't always have to be that way. There's a much easier way, and there's nothing wrong with it. The easier way is to be refuted. It's like being handed a wad of, it's better than being handed a wad of cash. Because there's not all that much useful you can do with money. There's a few useful things. But there's a lot more useful things you can do with truth. You can live in accordance with it. And here I am saying this on Amazon Prime Day. I wasted so much time today clicking around, looking at things I don't need, as like, so what, they're a few dollars off? I don't need them. I have no need for them. I could have done much better things with that time. Anyway, so we really gain something by being refuted is the point here. And the great thing, again, is that Socrates and Gorgias were able to agree on this point. And you could say, a critic might say, oh, Socrates is just what? Maybe warming up his opponent, maybe getting them ready to be more likely to submit to his argument. But I'm not going to take the cynical view, because I believe Socrates when he says that he direly wants to be refuted if he's wrong. He's not an ideologue. He doesn't go into these dialogues just absolutely dead set on proving one point, come what may. He enters every conversation he has dead set on one thing alone, the truth. And if he's wrong, he's very happy to be shown that. Of course, he's right in this dialogue. Well, I hope you agree that he's right. We'll talk about it in the upcoming minutes here, but in other dialogues, he does change his mind, certainly. And even if he doesn't absolutely change his mind, he has minor points, at least, that he's refuted on. And we'll talk about some things in this dialogue itself that maybe showed some room for improvement in Socrates' own arguments. We'll see. Anyway, let's get to what you did read here. I meant to have another copy on me that has the same page numbers as what I gave you guys. I don't, so hopefully you'll still be able to somewhat recall the things I refer to here without me giving you a page number. I just like to print my copies out with huge margins so I can take notes. Anyway, the first thing in the portion, in an abridged part that I gave you, Socrates says, cookery is the flattery disguised as medicine, and cosmetics is disguised as gymnastics in the same way. Crooked, deceptive, mean, slavish, deceiving by shaping, coloring, smoothing, dressing, making people assume a beauty which is not their own, neglecting the beauty of their own. So is sophistry to legislation, and as cookery is to medicine, so is rhetoric to justice. I'm going to break apart these analogies in a moment. But one more line here. He says, what I say rhetoric is, then you've heard it. It corresponds to cookery, doing in the soul what cookery does in the body. Other translations are more literal, and he says pastry baking. Nothing intrinsically wrong with a pastry. I enjoy pastries every now and then myself, but it's hard to argue that a pastry is what? It's not exactly the most, nutritious. It's clearly not particularly conducive to the health of the body. I don't know what's going on out there, but let me close this. He also has the analogy of cosmetics. Cosmetics does nothing to actually benefit the body, but it does give the appearance of a body being in better condition than it is, by trying to impart a superficial beauty to the body. Now, both of these examples are actually, I think, well chosen to show that Socrates is right, but he may be going a bit too hard against sophistry here, rhetoric, in that rhetoric, as the sophists use it, was this manipulative ploy. Of course, we talked about that last class. But in and of itself, the ability to be persuasive is not wrong. The point is, use it as a tool for the truth, not for error. In the same way, pastry baking is not wrong as long as it's kept in, as long as we eat pastries only insofar as it is not damaging to our health, and as long as cosmetics is not, and cosmetics is also not wrong as long as it's not taken to just enable and cover up an unhealthy lifestyle. So I think these are well-chosen analogies. But that aside, let's focus on the other side of the analogy, which is what Socrates is using to show what is wrong with sophistry. The sophists and their rhetoric, they present themselves as these orators who can lead people to believe whatever they want, but they're not leading people to justice and truth. They are flattering. Pastry baking, cookery, is to please the taste buds, not to give health to the body. Sophistry, rhetoric, is to flatter the hearers, not to lead the hearers to the truth. This dialogue itself, it's called Gorgias, obviously, but some people have referred to this dialogue as being entitled, because Plato didn't give them titles. Some have called it On Rhetoric, because I only gave you like 10 pages. Well, it's more like 60 pages long. And a lot of the stuff most of the stuff I cut out is on this question of rhetoric. And I don't think there's any need for us to dwell on that enormously, because the much more important stuff is the back and forth of Callicles on how we ought to live. But it's interesting how the question of rhetoric gets tied in with that. And Socrates is going to circle back to that question in an interesting way at the end of the dialogue. And we'll see that when we get to it. But for now, he just has a few things to say about rhetoric and how little power they have. Before we get to how little power they have, why on earth would a sophist want to flatter his hearers? Why flatter any? What is the motive for a sophist to flatter his hearers? It's not just that he enjoys it.
Isn't just telling people what they want to hear?
Yeah. If you tell people what they want to hear, you can what? Influence them, manipulate them, get what you need or what you want out of them. You can't, once Callicles walks in, he's going to admit, yeah, that's what I do. I flatter. I tell people what they want to hear. I'll say one thing one day and a different thing the other day. Socrates, on the other hand, always says the same thing all the time. Well, it doesn't seem like Callicles is doing much flattering to Socrates. Well, he's not, obviously. He's being quite a jerk, actually. Well, why not flatter Socrates? There's this paradox of power and profit and popularity. The more powerful you are, the more money you have, the more looks you have, the more popularity you have, the less you hear what? The truth. Why? Because everyone who chooses to flock to you, what? Wants something from you. Socrates doesn't have anything. He's completely poor, and he has nothing that Callicles wants. So Callicles is willing to not flatter Socrates. Anyway, we'll get to that when Callicles enters the fray. but just wanted to point out why the sophists don't always flatter. They flatter when it is in their best interest to flatter. If this were innocent entertainment, that would be one thing. You know, if the sophists were just putting on these comedy shows, then whatever. But they weren't. They were influencing legislation, they were influencing the courts, they were convincing people of their arguments, even though they were not true, so on and so forth. So it wasn't just innocent entertainment, it was a serious problem. All right, moving on though. What is the essence of the Socratic method as shown in the beginning of this reading? You've all probably heard of the Socratic method before, and it's usually discussed in grade school as teaching by asking questions, and that's part of it. But that also kind of misses the point here, because Socrates does not propose to teach anything. He just wants to talk. He wants to talk, and he wants to find the truth with you. He doesn't present himself as a teacher. He, however, does have a certain method that he tends to use. And we see an interesting portrayal of just a little bit of it on this first page. Let me read just a few back and forth, and then we'll try and take a look at what just happened. Polus. So do you think that good rhetors count as worthless in the cities as flatterers? Socrates. I think they don't count at all. Polus. What do you mean they don't count? Don't they have the greatest power in the cities? Socrates. No, not if you say that having power is a good to the man with the power. Polus. Well, I do say so. Socrates. Then I think the rhetors have the least power of anyone in the city. This is strange. Socrates says that the rhetors, the sophists, have the least power of anyone in the city. Polus is understandably confused by this, and he says, what? Aren't they like tyrants? Don't they kill whoever they want? Expropriate and expel from the cities whoever they think fit? Isn't this having great power? Socrates responds, no, at least Polus doesn't agree. I don't agree? Of course I agree. No, by the... ... Maybe it's bleeped out, I don't know. Indeed you don't. All right, this is looking pretty weird, and as Socratic dialogues often do. But what's going on here? Polus says something. Socrates says, oh, Polus doesn't agree with that. And that's kind of a strange thing to hear someone say to you, so understandably, Polus says, what are you talking about? I don't agree with it. Of course I agree with it. Socrates says, no, you do not. And this is because he knows he's about to engage in his trademark method. He's going to say that you don't agree with what you're saying, because you simply haven't thought. You haven't thought it through. You haven't thought your own starting point through. So what Socrates is going to do is he's going to stand right here with Polus. So this is allegorical. Intellectually, Polus is right here with some given premise that he already believes. Socrates knows that he's about to walk step by step with Polus through a logical chain of reasoning. And after a number of steps, all of a sudden, he's going to be back to where they started, but what? Facing the opposite direction. Socrates knows full well that he's just going to ask some questions, and he's going to help Polus, using his own logical reasoning, go step by step and realize that he actually himself doesn't even believe what he just said. The Socratic method. It's a little more interesting than just teaching by asking questions. So let's get something down for that. For that, we can put down, so use questions. And this isn't the totality of the Socratic method or the Socratic Elenchus, but it's part of it. So use questions to help someone see that his own premises his own meaning the person you're talking to, not yours. That the other person's own premises lead to different conclusions than he already holds. And I should say not only different, but contradictory. Why is this incredibly powerful? Well, most so-called debates today don't do this. They just, as I said in the first class, throw contradictory assertions at each other. They both say, oh, but this study says this, and this study says that, or something of that sort. This statistic says that, this other statistic says this. You can't do anything with that. Not in the midst of a dialogue, at least. That requires tons of homework and investigation and all research and study, and that's good. But that's not useful in the middle of talking with someone hoping to actually get anywhere with them. But if you use questions, as Socrates always does, and if you take for granted only those things that the person you're talking with already takes for granted, then you can actually build further conclusions off of that both of you will hold. And I don't want to say much more about that because I already talked about it 2 classes ago, but here's at least a bit more of a definition for it. Use questions to help someone see that his own premises lead to different conclusions than he already holds. And that's what he's about to do with Polus. I'm not going to go through all the details of it. You guys read through it and no doubt saw just how, I suppose I'll say convoluted it can be. Yes, it gets messy, but, well, life is messy. You got to just... Socrates didn't have the benefit of being able to script his interlocutors' answers, except for the brief part where Polus told him to go back and forth on his own, and that was a lot easier to read, consequently. But he just has to roll with what he's given. So throughout the next couple pages, which I won't go over all of, he's going to show that real power requires the intelligence to know what is good. It's not merely true power is not the mere physical ability to act upon one's whims. It is, it's often, in fact, the precise opposite. Now, true power also, Socrates is going to go into more detail on this later. True power, or I should say the greatest power, involves and requires the ability to defend oneself against the greatest harms. Which is more powerful? Which would give you a greater power? A pill that would cure athlete's foot or a pill that would cure cancer? Obviously a pill that would cure cancer. That would give you a much greater power because it is a defense against a greater evil. Well, Socrates is going to show throughout this dialogue that the only real evil and the greatest evil is not to suffer, it's not to feel pain, it's not even to be put to death, but it's what? To commit injustice. A rhetor is one who not only commits injustices by misleading the people, but has the, quote, power to get out of the only cure to the very sickness he has given himself by acting unjustly. So not only does he not have the power to know the good and the true and to act upon it, but he has the supposed power to get out of justice when justice is due, which only in truth makes him even less powerful. So a rhetor has no real power. What is rhetoric according to Socrates? Well, he compares it, as we know, to flattery or cookery. He compares, let me do some erasing here. All right, rhetoric according to Socrates is like cookery or cosmetics. It is flattery, and it is a knack, not a craft. A craft is kind of like an art or a science or a legitimate skill. A craft has objective principles, clear criteria, and an end to which it is directed, that is outside of itself, an end that it is always aiming at. Rhetoric doesn't have that. Rhetoric is something that some people apparently have a knack for, Socrates says, and it's not even directed at any good. Its only goal is to flatter the people so as to manipulate them. But what even is that? Depends upon what the highest bidder wants. whatever the highest bidder wants is not an objective criteria to give an end to a craft. So it's just a knack, Socrates says. More on that later. This question of what is true power is a very major one that Plato will revisit a number of times. But try to think of some examples. True power, we're always coming back to this idea of tyrants in ancient Greek philosophy, because they were big then and they're big now and they'll always be big. But that a tyrant has no real power, we'll see in the Republic as well. Think about, well, I live with a few tyrants because I have children who are toddlers. It's okay for a toddler to be a tyrant because they don't know any better. But if I were to give a 3-year-old the remote control to the television, I don't have a television, but if I had one and I gave him the remote, I have just given him the physical ability to change the channel to whatever he wants. Have I given him any sort of true power? Certainly not anything in the positive sense of the word, because he's going to what? He's going to start clicking the buttons, and he'll probably just mess up the TV. But worse, more likely, he'll probably just pull up something that's going to scar him for the rest of his life, which is another reason I don't have a TV. But that's obviously not true power. Why? Because he has no idea how to use it. He has no idea what the use of a remote control should be directed at. So he's just going to click away at a whim. He's going to do all sorts of harmful stuff. He doesn't even know what he's doing. That's exactly what a tyrant is like. According to Socrates, it's exactly what a sophist is like. It's exactly what a rhetor is like. Just like a small child will click away at a whim on the buttons, so too, one of those people will just flatter whoever he can so as to get money out of him maybe, or some other ulterior motive. But he hasn't even bothered to ask what these motives themselves are directed towards. Well, they're directed towards nothing. They're random, kind of. They act by chance, he says later. All right. Now we get to Socrates' essential question. He brings it up very early on here in the dialogue. It's a very ironic one, quintessential Socrates. Which is worse? So we talked about the which is better, to refute or to be refuted, but we're on to a much more serious question now, one that everybody must consider in order to determine how one is going to live. Pivotal, and Polus actually agrees with Socrates after a number of back and forths. Not at first, but does anyone recall that question? Which is worse, blank or blank? With Polus in the beginning, I mean. He says, which is worse? Which do you think is worse, Polus? Doing injustice or suffering it? Committing injustice versus suffering injustice. You don't need this specifically down. I'll give you something to have down in a moment. Whoops. Suffering injustice. Right away, Polus says what we all probably are tempted to say right away. Well, I don't want to feel pain, so of course it's worse to suffer injustice. But then right away, Socrates gets Polus to basically acknowledge what is necessary to acknowledge in order to lead to the true answer to this question. And he says, which is more shameful, to do injustice or to suffer it? Right away, Polus admits it is more shameful to commit an injustice. All right, shame. What is shame? Well, what's the difference between shame and embarrassment? Shame has what associated with it that simply being embarrassed by something doesn't? Guilt, exactly. There's all sorts of things that we'd be embarrassed by, but we wouldn't be ashamed. You know, if you forget to lock the door to the bathroom and someone walks in, you're not ashamed because we all have to go to the bathroom. You're embarrassed. But if you get caught lying, cheating, stealing, that's you rightly feel shame. Because there's guilt. Why? Because you know that you did something you shouldn't have done. And Socrates is trying to reverse engineer that intuition, which is what philosophy is often all about, reverse engineering intuition. And I don't just mean any little instinct. I mean those universal, fundamental human intuitions that we simply can't escape. If you reverse engineer a product, you are presupposing that product is what? If you're going to waste the time, I should say, if you're going to spend the time to reverse engineer a product, you're presupposing that product is what? What's that? Valuable. Yeah, exactly. It's a good product. You would, some piece of garbage that doesn't even work, you're not going to waste much time reverse engineering. But if it's a really good one, you want to uncover what principles are hidden within its very operation, so that you can know them and hold them as your own principles. To continue the analogy, you would want to make your own products using the same principles. Well, philosophy is often trying to figure out what principles justify those fundamental, universal human intuitions that exist. Some philosophies, of course, don't operate that way. They operate specifically trying to refute the fundamental, universal human intuitions. Certainly not the way I approach philosophy, and it's not the way I recommend anyone do so. Again, philosophy should explain common sense, not explain it away. So we have this fundamental human intuition that it is shameful to be caught committing an injustice. And it is more shameful than being caught suffering one. If two people walk into class with a black eye, and it's, one of them was punched unjustly, and one of them was warded off after attacking someone unjustly, well, one person's going to feel a lot more shame, hopefully, than the other one. Why is that the case? Well, Socrates is trying to figure out why that's the case. And he basically says, okay, that can't be the case because it's more painful. Because clearly it is not more painful to commit an injustice. It's much more painful to suffer one. And yet we somehow still call it more shameful to commit an injustice. Socrates says that must be because there is some other. It says, by exceeding the other things, pain and whatever else, in some remarkably serious harm, an amazing evil, the baseness of soul is the most shameful of all, since it doesn't exceed in pain on your account. Before that, Socrates says, would you choose the more evil and shameful over the less? Don't shrink from answering, Polus. You won't be harmed at all. But present yourself nobly to the argument. Socrates uses the Greek logos there. As to a doctor. Answer. Say either yes or no to what I'm asking you. Well, no, I wouldn't choose it, Socrates. And would any other man? I don't think so by this argument anyway, Polus responds. Then what I was saying was true, Socrates says, that neither I nor you nor any other man would choose doing injustice over suffering it, for it's actually worse. He proves this very quickly to Polus, and Polus is being, he's being honest, and he's actually dialoguing and granting the concessions that should be granted, which Callicles in the next couple pages will not do. Socrates says to Polus, what I already read, another translation is, nobly resign yourself to the healing hand of the argument. It's necessary to nobly resign ourselves to the healing hand of the argument, otherwise it won't heal. If you fight the doctor's cure hard enough, the doctor won't be able to cure you. Well, it's the same way with an argument. And we all know that's true because we've all talked to stubborn people who saw the truth right there in front of their eyes but refused to acknowledge it. We probably all have to talk to stubborn people all the time. So clearly, this demeanor of being willing to resign ourselves to a healing hand of an argument is necessary. All right, so this question of which is worse, committing an injustice or suffering it. It's not this ridiculous waste of time. There's this game, I think it's called Would You Rather. Anyone ever heard of it? It's like a card game, where these stupid, horrible, usually disgusting scenarios are presented to you, and you have to choose which one you'd rather do. Scenarios that you'll almost definitely never be in. But this isn't just some exercise in futility. This isn't some purely academic speculation. The whole point of asking which is worse is because once we've answered that question, we what? You always what? What is worse? Avoid. Yeah, you always avoid what is worse and pursue what is better. Very simple. We have to ask ourselves which is worse, or conversely, which is better. In any fundamental scenario, this is very broad in general. This isn't like, would you rather lose your this finger here or that toe over there, which hopefully we'll never have to choose between. Maybe we would, and it'd be interesting to think about for a few seconds maybe. But we're constantly going to be in situations. We have to decide, are we going to commit an injustice here? Or are we going to allow ourselves to suffer one? In other words, to allow one to happen to us. Well, if we're going to choose wisely, we can't just say cross that bridge and you get to it. That's a good response to bridges you might never get to, but it's not a good response to bridges you know you will get to, bridges that permeate our lives. In that case, when we just say, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it, we're just procrastinating, and we're basically stuck with what? Making the decision when it must be made. Not reason, but what? Maybe passion, instinct, spur of the moment decision, which is usually not good. So it's much better to consider these questions calmly, hopefully rationally, before the heat of the moment arises. Committing an injustice or suffering one. Well, it's going to be more interesting when Callicles enters the scene here. He talks about how he says, money making rids us of poverty, medicine rids us of sickness, administration of justice rids us of intemperance and injustice. Paul says, apparently. Socrates responds, well then, which is the more wretched of two people, who have an evil either in body or in soul? The one who is treated and gets rid of the evil, or the one who isn't treated and still has it? Well, obviously the one who isn't treated, Polus says, is in a worse condition. Now, isn't paying justice getting rid of the greatest evil, baseness, that is injustice? Polus, yes it is. Socrates, and isn't this the man, in fact, whoever does the greatest injustices and exercises the greatest injustice and manages not to be corrected or punished, not to pay justice, as you say Archelaus and the other tyrants and rhetorics and dynasts managed to do? Polus admits it looks like it. Socrates, all right, if these things are true, then what is the great use of rhetoric, Polus? All it does is give you the ability to get rid of the only cure that's going to help you if injustice has invaded your life. It's like a spoiled child who simply knows how to finagle more treats out of his mother every time he wants them. It's not in the best interest of anyone, much less the tyrant himself, or the rhetor, or the sophist himself. So, someone who has committed injustice, Socrates says he should go voluntarily, wherever he will pay justice, as quickly as possible, to the court of justice as to the doctor, eager to prevent the disease of injustice from being chronic, and making his soul festering and incurable. This is very ironic. Much of what Socrates says is, but it's got a very important point to it. Committing injustice messes us up. We all know that because we all feel guilt as much as we try to run from it, perhaps. It's there when we commit an injustice, when we do something we know we shouldn't have done. So we want to get rid of it. You can try to get rid of it by pretending you didn't do anything wrong, but that won't last long. It will come back to haunt you. So a much better way of dealing with the situation, of dealing with this injustice of soul, is what? Well, Socrates says getting justice. So why don't people just run to the court of law every time they broke the law and try to get punished? Well, this isn't primarily about crime and punishment and laws. Maybe it was more back then, but there's a much more important, and that's important, but there's a more important lesson here. Let's make it personal. Let's just think about our own friends. It's hard to have the same sense towards society and government and law in the city today as they did then, when it was so integral to who you were, your city. It was like you. It's hard for us to understand that today. But we still understand friendship. And I'm looking forward to when we get time to cover Aristotle's teachings on that. When you realize that you've done something to harm a friend, you realize how wrong it was, what do you want to do? You want to make it up, exactly. You want to make it up. You realize that that is a good thing, that even if it costs you significantly, even if it's a great burden for you to do, even if it's very difficult, you rightly want to make it up. And making it up, well, what does that mean? Making something up is like restoring a what? A balance, exactly. That's exactly what justice does when injustice has happened. It restores a balance. Justice, most broadly defined, is simply rendering what is due. Well, what is due when you have done something wrong, when you have done when you have wronged somebody, some sort of restitution is called for. Justice, but if we do talk about justice as criminal punishment, you don't need this down, but, and this is no criminal justice class, but it's worth briefly considering the philosophy of justice. I'll have a discussion sheet later on some other questions about this, but why do we want justice, specifically considered as criminal punishment in this context?
Peace of mind.
What's that?
Peace of mind.
Peace of mind, okay. Yeah, kind of give the victims like a sense of closure, kind of. Yeah, certainly. What else do we want from justice? Satisfaction, yeah. We want the sense of balance. Very pragmatically speaking, why do we have criminal punishment? We want people to pay, definitely. And we want what hanging over people's heads who are thinking about committing crimes? D. Fear, yes. To have, and there's a D word that goes with this. Close. Deterrence. We hope that the existence of criminal punishment will deter future crimes from committing. Now, I'm actually very glad that you guys were hesitant to give this answer, because in other groups, this would be the very first and almost the only answer given. Because that's what the philosophy of pragmatism rejects, all this stuff like justice and balance and fundamental human intuitions. It cares only about utilitarianism and quantifying the pros and cons of every decision as pleasure and pain, economics, finances, so on and so forth. And deterrence is all that really comes to mind in that regard. But this is a side effect. Yes, that's important, don't get me wrong. But that is a side effect of justice. That is not its primary purpose. Socrates here is saying what the primary purpose of justice is, rightfully so. The purpose of justice is to cure injustice. Very simple. In other words, justice should, I'm not saying this is how we do it today, unfortunately, but it should be primarily, as ironic as this sounds, the administration of justice should be primarily done because of the best interest of who? Not the victim, the offender. Justice is to heal the offender. Okay, we do have another word for that today. We have to make up new words for everything that we want to bring back from tradition for some reason. Rehabilitation. Now, this is even more important. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen too well today. People don't exactly come out of prison great saints. It often makes them worse. So we have got to, and I'm not saying I have the answers here, but I at least see that we have a problem that worthy minds need to address. But it does help some. I've had a lot of students who are very forthright with me about how they changed their lives after prison and how it did give them a wake-up call. So sometimes it still does have the effect that it's traditionally intended to have. But unfortunately, that effect has become more and more rare. So that's a major question, is how we can fix the justice system. And just keep that in your minds. Anyway, let's continue on here. Socrates is about to make his most ironic point that he ever made, I think. I can't say that for sure, but this must be a contender at least. he says, all right, turning it around the opposite way. If we really should harm anyone, an enemy or anyone at all, if he treats someone else unjustly, we should take every precaution in speaking and in action to prevent him from paying justice and appearing before the court of justice. And if he appears, we must arrange it so that he escapes and doesn't pay justice. But if he has stolen a lot of money, we must see that he doesn't pay it back, but keeps it and spends it on himself and on his relatives, unjustly and godlessly. And if he has done injustice deserving death, we must see that he does not suffer death. Best of all, to be immortal in his baseness, but otherwise to live the longest as possible in this condition. Okay. Most important point of this, you shouldn't hate anybody. You shouldn't want to harm anybody. Socrates is not saying you should ever want to harm anybody. That's the whole foundation of this ironic point here. But if you did, theoretically, if hypothetically you really wanted to harm someone, Socrates is saying you should what? Help them to what? Not only commit evil actions, but get away with them for the rest of his life. Because committing injustice is the worst thing for you. But what makes that worse still is never getting the only cure for that injustice. And of course, we should never actually do this. He's making a point with irony here. But I think Socrates has been vindicated. You know, one of the worst things a parent can do for a child is what? Spoil him. Never discipline him. Let him get away with everything. Always give him what he wants. That's one of the ways to raise just like a terrible person. Let's think about a different example. I love children. I love my kids. It's just sometimes they work for good examples for little tyrants also. How about a serious example? How about these serial sexual abusers who have been revealed in increasing numbers only in the past couple of years? They've been doing this evil stuff for decades now, getting away with it year after year after year, committing these injustices. Was it good for them that they got away with it? Did that help them or anybody? Of course not. It wasn't good for them, it certainly wasn't good for their victims, and it really wasn't good for the victims that were yet to come. It would have been much better for everybody, including the abusers themselves, if only as soon as they first started doing this evil stuff, if they were what? Reported right away. That would have been best for them and best for everybody. And I'm not blaming the victims here, trust me. I'm sure it's a horrible situation, very difficult to go up against someone of great power. But still, I think at least in principle we can all agree it would have been much better if they were given justice right away. Would have been better for them also. Maybe they would have reformed themselves earlier. But instead, they got away with it year after year after year, and it became a lifestyle. And then it became not only a lifestyle, but an institutional culture. Not only in one institution, but in so many. So this is a vindication of Socrates. This is exactly what happens when injustice is not given the cure of justice. Just like a disease can fester and get worse and worse, like he's saying here, if it's not treated, same thing with injustice, but on a much more serious scale, because it is the disordering of the soul, not just of the body. Anyway, as much as we can see, I hope, the validity of what Socrates is saying if we really pause. There's someone here who didn't have much time to pause, and he was standing here the whole dialogue. In fact, this dialogue might even have taken place at his house. It's hard to tell. Callicles. Callicles is standing there this whole time, listening to all these things Socrates is saying, probably getting more and more angry, waiting for the right time to enter into the fray. And he couldn't hold himself back anymore, because this sounds so insane, what Socrates just said. I'm not denying that it sounds insane at first glance. So here's Callicles. Tell me, Chaerephon, is Socrates in earnest about all this, or is he joking? Clearly, he doesn't exactly enter in the nicest way. Chaerephon says, well, there's nothing like asking him. Now Callicles turns to Socrates. He says, tell me, Socrates, are we to suppose that you're in earnest now or joking? For if you're in earnest, and all of these things you say are really true, then wouldn't the life of us men be upside down? And don't we apparently do everything that's the opposite of what we should do? What's Callicles' point? Socrates must be crazy because this is just what? It's just not how people live. Socrates, remember, Socrates has just proven, I would say close enough to proven, to Polus, that it is worse to commit an injustice and that we must consequently much more zealously avoid committing injustice than suffering it. But anybody who wasn't born yesterday, anyone who has, been outside and seen other people and seen the way people tend to behave and tend to act and tend to treat each other realizes very quickly that this principle doesn't exactly exhibit itself too well in society, does it? Because people tend to be much more zealous to what? Avoid pain than to avoid doing what is wrong. And I hate to have to say the word most, but I think I have to here. I have to agree with Socrates and Callicles, ironically, that, most people seem much more zealous to avoid suffering injustice than they do than to avoid committing it, unfortunately. So most people in their very lives contradict this principle all the time. Callicles sees that and he says, Socrates, you must be wrong. This is simply not the way people act, therefore you must be wrong. And of course that's an absurd conclusion because momentum is not its own justification. Quote, everybody's doing it justifies nothing at all. That is never an excuse for anything, much less committing injustice. But we have to give Callicles credit, at least for an accurate observation of the way things are, I think. Most people are much more zealous to avoid getting gypped in some transaction than they are to avoid gypping someone else. Most people are much more zealous to avoid being cheated on than to avoid being a cheater. You think about the Titanic going down. And what's the problem when the Titanic's going down? There's not enough what? Not enough lifeboats because of the arrogance of those who built it. This happens whenever man becomes arrogant and proud. But anyway, I digress. Well, there's not enough lifeboats and not everybody in the Titanic is going to get a spot. So what happens? Well, people are fighting over the spots. And yes, there are noble people who will give their spot up to someone else even if they have one already. And that's exactly what Socrates would say you must do. Because if there's not enough spots in the lifeboats and you grab one, you are risking committing an injustice because maybe somebody else really would have been an even better fit for that spot than you. Maybe someone else really needed that spot even more than you did. You're really risking this if you go down with it. But guess what? That's not a hard decision. It's not a hard decision at all, because we know that this is worse. Well, Callicles is looking at the fighting. He wasn't at the Titanic, I know, but I'm saying allegorically here, he's looking at all the fighting going on in the Titanic over the lifeboats. He's concluding that no, it must be much worse to suffer injustice, because that's what people are avoiding more zealously. And he's going to give his argument over the next couple pages, but a brief preview. Socrates is saying the good life is the one that avoids this, because this is the worst thing. So the good man is the one who gives up his seat to someone else. Who does Callicles say the good man is? The really awesome man, maybe superior man. For Callicles, the superior man is the one who's strong enough to take a seat no matter what, even if he has to grab it from somebody else. Because this is the most shameful thing for Callicles, to suffer.
How would the injustice go on to survive?
Yeah, if there's enough spots, take a seat, definitely, because you have a duty to preserve your own life. But it's the situations where it's a matter of choosing who who gets the spot. You're driving, none of us are ever going to be in the Titanic, because that's gone. Let's take a situation we might actually be in. You're driving down the road really fast, and you realize that because of you didn't see what was coming up, and unfortunately, due to the situation you're in, there is no way that you are going to do anything but hit a pedestrian or drive off this bridge. Like, those are your only two options. You definitely shouldn't want to die. You definitely shouldn't want to drive off the bridge. But by choosing to hit the pedestrian, you may well be committing you are committing an injustice. By driving off the bridge, yes, you're suffering. Maybe you call it injustice, maybe not. Whatever, you're certainly suffering. Of course, Socrates would say, suffer, don't commit. Callicles would say, commit, don't suffer. Because to suffer is weakness. To suffer shows your inferiority, according to Callicles. And we'll see him say it in his own words in a minute. But this foreshadows a certain philosophy of someone in the 1800s. Does anyone know what 1800s philosopher this is almost verbatim the same as? Friedrich Nietzsche, The Will to Power. For Nietzsche, evil is only whatever stems from weakness. The will failing to fully exercise itself.
So what if there were more people in the car than just one?
Yeah, that complicates it, doesn't it? Certainly. Yeah, Socrates definitely doesn't have the answer to all the various ethical dilemmas. The trolley problem wasn't very popular in his day, to say the least. He's dead set on giving us the principles that we can apply to the vast majority of situations we'll be in. How to balance quantitatively numbers of lives likely lost with different contingencies. That's probably a couple thousand years before people really started diving into those questions. Maybe in a future discussion we can get into something called the doctrine of the double effect, which is, I think, the most powerful tool for dealing with ethical dilemmas. I don't think it figures them all out. I don't want to dive too deeply into that right now for the sake of time, but I think it will come up soon. But yeah, he doesn't have the answer to all those things, but he does want to at least give us the general disposition. The disposition of preferring suffering and justice to committing it. Because he's not this Kantian deontological, you must do what's right simply because it's right and for no other reason. That's Immanuel Kant's duty ethics. Immanuel Kant, one of the most famous philosophers. But Socrates is dead set on convincing you that not only is that true, not only is that right to avoid injustice, but it's actually best for you. It's okay to care about yourself. And if you really care about yourself, you will avoid injustice above all other things, because committing injustice harms you more than anything else harms you. And I think those who have spent some time of their lives with an unhappy conscience, and who have spent some time in their life with a happy conscience, are well aware of that fact, that nothing harms one more than committing injustice. Anyway, the interesting thing here is that Socrates doesn't respond to Callicles right away. Apparently there's some history here. It's strange. I don't know why Socrates didn't just respond right away, but instead he responds to Callicles' incredulity. Callicles is understandably so incredulous at this ironic point Socrates just made. Socrates says, Callicles in the assembly, democratic assembly in Athens, if you're saying something and the Athenian demos says it's not so, you change and say what it wants. Callicles doesn't deny that. He says, yeah, I'm a reed swaying in the breeze of the political pressures of the populace. Socrates then says, but philosophy always stays the same. Philosophy always stays the same. Doesn't matter what the audience is, doesn't matter what the time is, it's perennial. The perennial nature of philosophy, or at least it should be perennial. All right, what does that word remind you of, perennial? What's that? Sorry? Repeat, yeah? And it's okay if you have a lowly, non-philosophical thing that comes to mind when I say perennial. Flowers. As opposed to what kind of a flower? Anyway. Perennial flowers don't need to be planted every year. They just keep coming back. Well, there's always been a notion that philosophy is perennial because it is something, it should be something, discovered, not invented. And I've talked about that distinction last week, but Socrates is bringing it up here. It's rhetoric or sophistry is going to be changing all the time because it exists simply to please the hearers so as to manipulate them, and is not concerned with the truth, which doesn't change. It's very strange. You hear it often said, oh, well, that might have been true in their day, but not in ours. You might as well say something's true on Tuesday, but not on Thursday. The accident of time has no bearing on the truth of a proposition, because philosophy, indeed, as Socrates says, is perennial. We can be wrong, certainly, but if we're right, then we can't simply contradict that because opinions have changed, preferences have changed, times have changed. No one pretends that that's the case with math, but it shouldn't be the case with philosophy either. If you come up with a computer programming language, you can change it all you want, because it's an invention. But we can't change what we discover. All right. Callicles is going to have some strong words now. Some very strong words. I'm going to skip through most of them, but I'll read just a couple little excerpts to give you a sense of just where Callicles is coming from, maybe just how angry he is. And I want to put some things on the board soon, so let me just practice some erasing here. Okay. Polus laughed at you at first. This is Callicles, rightly, I think. But now you have done the same thing over again to him. And for just this I can't admire Polus myself, for his concession to you, that doing injustice is more shameful than suffering it. That's kind of sad. All of a sudden Callicles and Polus were on the same side, and all of a sudden Callicles is here saying, I can't admire Polus anymore. Because Polus was willing to be open to good dialogue. Anyway. He says, this is the case not by nature, but only by rule or convention. Nature versus rule. And I've always intended to make this discussion sheet longer because there's so much important stuff in this dialogue. But since I don't have this as a question, you don't need it down. Callicles is very angry above all that Polus conceded that it is more shameful to commit an injustice than to suffer it. Callicles is saying that's only a rule, that's only a petty convention, that's not nature, that's not the law of nature, that's not the natural law. And here's the interesting point here. We addressed relativism and subjectivism last class. I'm not coming back to that again here because that's not what Callicles is. Callicles is not giving the usual cheap cop-out to strong assertions of morality by saying, oh, it's all relative to culture, society, time, whatever. That's not what Callicles is saying at all. He's saying, no, there is a right. There is a natural law. There is a right and a wrong, and it is this. It is right for the strong to take whatever they can, and that's all there is to it. The strong taking whatever they are strong enough to take. That is the law of nature. And to fail, for the strong to fail to do so, that is the only shameful thing. I'm going to read that in his own words in a moment here. But, we should briefly address the notion that Callicles is not addressing, is not bringing up here, that there isn't a distinction at all between nature and rule. That's a much more popular thing to hear today, that there is no moral law itself, there is no natural law itself, there's just conventions. Well, you hear that primarily argued by certain texts that bring up a few examples of various areas of morality where there's differing opinions from time to place. And there certainly are, don't get me wrong. But I do not hesitate to say that they vastly overestimate the difference and they gloss over the unanimity. Look through all times, all cultures, all nations, all religions, all places. Try and find for me one that says it's a good thing and it's right to backstab your friends, cheat on your spouse, be completely selfish and hedonistic, fail to give aid to someone in need because you're afraid. You won't find anything, any culture anywhere, anytime, any place that advocates for these things. Why? Because there is a natural law. There is a moral law. There is a right and a wrong. It's not purely subjective. It's not purely relative. It exists, and we must discover it. Obviously, there's disagreements, and we have to dialogue about those. Anyway, enough about that, because it's simply not what Callicles is saying. Again, he's saying there is a right, and it is this: the strong must rule. Let's see how he puts it. By nature, everything is more shameful, which is also worse. Suffering injustice, but by rule, doing injustice is more shameful. In my view, however, those who lay down the rules are the weak men, the many. And so they lay down their rules and assign their praise and blame with their eye in themselves and their own advantage. They terrorize the stronger men capable of having more. And to prevent these men from having more than themselves, they say that taking more is shameful and unjust, and that doing injustice is this, seeking to have more than other people. They're satisfied if they themselves have an equal share, because they are inferior. But I think nature itself shows this, that it is just for the better man to have more than the worse, and the more powerful than the less powerful. Nature shows this in so many areas. Among other animals and whole cities and races of men, that the just stands decided in this way. The superior rules over the weaker and has more. We mold, he continues on, we mold the best and strongest among us, taking them from youth up like lions, and tame them by spells and incantations over them until we enslave them, telling them that they ought to have equal shares, and that this is fine and just. But I think that if a man is born with a strong enough nature, he will shake off and smash and escape all this. He will trample on all of our writings, charms, incantations, and all the rules contrary to nature. He rises up and shows himself master, this slave of ours. And there the justice of nature suddenly bursts into light. Wow. You don't hear something like that put so explicitly too often. I know there's a lot in that, but what has Callicles just advocated for? A radical form of what? He's saying, first of all, he's saying we take the best and strongest among us and we tame them by spells and incantations. He doesn't mean that literally. It's not literally that we recite spells over these youth. He's referring, that's moral philosophy. Teaching right versus wrong is taming these strong youth with spells that they could have risen up and smashed those constraints, but we tame them. He's saying nature only shows this. The stronger should have more. Someday, he's hoping, someone will be born with a strong enough nature and will shake off and smash and escape all of this, trampling on all of these rules contrary to nature. It's exactly what Nietzsche is advocating for in the Übermensch, the Superman, the one whose will reign so supreme and autonomous that it will shake off the very shackles of reason itself, trampling upon its dominion over the will. Define good and evil in his own terms and thereby rise above good and evil. Nietzsche is famous for his beyond good and evil assertion. This is exactly what Callicles is saying 2,400 years earlier, maybe 2,300 years before Nietzsche. This is a radical form of social Darwinism. What's that? Exactly. Survival of the fittest. Sink or swim. Let the strong take whatever they can, because clearly there's something good in them, and you should let them take and take and take and take. And those who cannot defend themselves against the strong, they're better off being gotten rid of anyway. That's Callicles' view, that's Nietzsche's view, that's the social Darwinism view. In an extreme form, this would become downright anarchy. In a less extreme form, it might look like what? Anarcho-capitalism. I'm not about to rant against capitalism itself, but an extreme form of capitalism would certainly be what Callicles is advocating for here, where the mere ability to do something is its own justification. So if some big business moves in to a given locality and sells its products extremely cheaply for a little while so as to what? Exactly, get rid of put the small businesses there out of business, and then jack their prices way up so they can make tons of profit. An ordinary person would look at that and rightly say that's a horrible injustice that just happened. That's obvious. I think it's just about anyone will admit that's a very bad thing. Well, what would Callicles say about that? That was awesome, because that was the strong taking what he could. That was one who had the strength to get what he wanted, taking what he wanted. More power to him. Now, very few people talk this way, but a lot of people think this way without talking this way. This is why Socrates is so happy to have stumbled upon Callicles. And we'll get to that in a minute here. Socrates himself is going to say it. Okay, he continues the rant. Callicles here continues the rant against the man. I have a note here. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I have Mein Kampf was plagiarized from Callicles. It wasn't literally plagiarized, but you see my point here. That's certainly, we see certainly a lot of Hitler's own philosophy kind of permeated with, kind of embedded within what Callicles is saying. Has anyone ever heard of Godwin's law? Godwin's law? Okay, Godwin's law is this supposed law that whenever any debate is continued for long enough, it's just a matter of time until Hitler is brought up. And he came up with this thing to point out how ridiculous that is, but I don't find it ridiculous at all. History has given us excellent examples of, and I don't see any reason not to repeatedly learn from them day after day. Why not? I fully advocate for what I call the Hitler test. If believing in a given philosophy does not allow you to logically, consistently condemn what Hitler did, then it is not a good philosophy. Very simple test. And it works very well for many philosophies. It certainly condemns Callicles' philosophy of might makes right. And let me just put that down since I've already said it. This is one of Callicles' primary doctrines. Might makes right. Might makes right. Those aren't the specific words used by him, but it encapsulates well in just a few words exactly what he's saying. And it's particularly fascinating how different this is from a quote I love from a man that hopefully all Americans love, more than just Americans, Abraham Lincoln. He said, "Let us have faith that right makes might. And let us dare to do our duty, and in that faith, let us dare to do our duty as we understand it." Sounds so similar. Might makes right, and right makes might. And yet it's completely causally inverted, and it means the opposite. Sometimes causally inverted things that are actually opposite might superficially look similar. But we have to be so careful not to assume the causality is one way or the other. Otherwise we could read major errors into things. Lincoln is saying, let's first care about what's right. Let's first do what's right. Let's trust that doing what's right is going to bring the power to do what we must with it. That's what he's saying by saying, let us have faith that right makes might. What Callicles is saying is that right isn't even distinct from might. Might simply is right. The mere power to do something is its own justification, because might makes right. It's the opposite, actually, of what Lincoln is saying. So there's one of his laws. Anyway, finishing his rant against the man, he polishes it off with a rant against philosophy. I don't suppose, this is not one of the things I covered in class 1 when we talked about why philosophy, why not just blank, why. This is not one of the objections to philosophy that we covered in class 1, because it's not one I hear too often, but Callicles certainly has this to say. He says, "When I see an older man still philosophizing and not giving it up, I think this man needs a beating, Socrates. For as I was saying just now, this person is bound to end up being unmanly. So Callicles says, okay, it's fine for a boy to philosophize. I don't know many boys who philosophize, but whatever. It's fine for a boy to philosophize, but when a man is philosophizing, it's ridiculous and unmanly and deserving of a beating, Callicles says. All right, so Callicles has just ranted in the most extreme terms against Socrates' argument. He's ranted against the man, society. He's ranted against philosophy itself. And he told Socrates that he's unmanly and needs a beating. How does Socrates respond? He says, Callicles, you are solid gold. It's not the exact phrase he uses, but that's basically what he says. He says, if I had a soul made of gold, Callicles, don't you think that I'd be delighted to find one of those stones in which they test gold? I've stumbled upon that lucky find now by stumbling upon you. And you could say he's being sarcastic, and I'm sure there's a hint of facetiousness in there, but he's not being completely sarcastic. He means it. Socrates is thrilled to have stumbled upon Callicles. He doesn't care that Callicles just said that he needs a beating and he's unmanly. Socrates, it has been said, rightfully so, that you are as big as the littlest thing that bothers you. It's not easy to bother Socrates. You're not going to bother him by some petty little jab. If petty little jabs bother you that much, well, that's how big you are. Anyway, he is genuinely thrilled to have stumbled upon Callicles. Why? Well, there's two reasons. One of them I alluded to a couple minutes ago. Another one is buried within the text here. Does anyone remember? Why is Callicles actually why is Socrates legitimately happy to have stumbled upon Callicles? First reason is, yes.
Just because he actually discusses it.
Yeah, that's the real big one. Is that, and he doesn't say this for a couple more pages, but yeah, it's the real reason that Callicles is a find is because he is willing to say openly what other people think but are too ashamed to say. Because many people really are, in their heads, they don't bring this to light, they're working behind their decisions or these rationalization thought processes that are always looking for ways to take things unjustly as long as what? As long as they can get away with it. That's the Callicles speaking in your head. We all have that Callicles somewhere in there. Key is to not dialogue with them in your head. The very same things that are going on inside so many people's heads but are never brought to light, Callicles is actually saying. But Socrates couldn't address these things until someone actually said them, because Socrates doesn't just sit down and write these treatises. He's no Aristotle. He just goes and talks to people, which is superior than writing, so that's all he did. He knew how to write. He just didn't bother with it. He had better things to do. He was talking to people. So he finally had the opportunity to address this subtle rationalization that is lurking in all of our consciouses or subconsciouses, trying to justify taking things unjustly as long as we can get away with it. Because we're all tempted to suppose that might makes right. So finally Socrates can address this argument since it has been brought to light. Second reason he's thrilled to have stumbled upon Callicles. I'll take a break in just a couple minutes here. Callicles is at the extreme opposite end of Socrates ideologically. Socrates, you could rightly argue, as you kind of alluded to there, Vic, is almost to a fault, like dismissive of his own safety completely. Like he doesn't even care at all. All he cares about is doing what's right and nothing else. Callicles is the extreme opposite end. All he cares about is himself, his pleasure, getting whatever he's strong enough to take, so on and so forth. If you have extreme opposite ends of the ideological spectrum coming into contact on a given issue, what is the great, at least, possibility there? Even if it's not hugely likely, what is the great potential in that situation? They aim for this in politics a lot. I don't know how often it happens, but it's aimed for. It happened, I recall one case in the news in the last few months where it happened significantly. One of the most liberal members of Congress and one of the most conservative members of Congress came together and co-sponsored the same piece of legislation. So what does it say when people at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum are willing to come together and both propose the same view? Yeah, it's a very strong. It's at least a very strong indication that this is solid. The specific example, I hope I have this right, was I don't even know if I can say her name. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is that right? And Ted Cruz co-sponsored the same bill to oppose former members of Congress from going into lobbying, which is clearly something that shouldn't happen. Like, lobbying in and of itself is a huge problem. It's causing all of these special interests to have a say, way too much of a say in politics, contradicting the common good. Clearly, at the very minimum, we shouldn't let the very people who were in the inner circles in Congress be the lobbyists themselves. So people at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum are capable of seeing that same truth, and that means it's probably very solid. It's probably very trustworthy. Socrates is hoping that that's exactly what he can get to happen here. Unfortunately, he's a little too optimistic, because that didn't happen. But still, a lot of awesome things happen in the next several pages. But let's take a look at those after a bit of a well-deserved break. So we left off with Socrates insisting that he's just incredibly fortunate to have stumbled upon Callicles for a couple of reasons, and now they need to talk. And Socrates repeats just a couple little things from Callicles' rants to make sure he's understanding what exactly Callicles is asserting, and in so doing, he actually demolishes Callicles' whole argument. All it takes is one counterexample to destroy a universal principle. Sometimes there are cases where it is said the exception proves the rule. Has anyone heard that phrase before, the exception proves the rule? And sometimes that's true. The mere fact that if you look at and this is the example I always use, I know, because it's a close at hand one, literally. If you see a hand with 4 fingers, you think it's off precisely because it is an exception that proves the rule that a human hand is a 5-fingered thing. The mere fact that it is recognized as something different is a reminder that a human hand is by nature a 5-fingered thing. But if something is proposed as a universal principle, as an absolute principle, then all it takes is one counterexample to disprove it. And that's exactly what Socrates does. I can't remember how many people got this, and I feel a little bad about it because it's kind of buried in the text there. But he says, first of all, remember, Callicles' whole argument is the strong should take whatever they can, and that is justice. What is right is the strong taking whatever they're strong enough to take. Well, that certainly doesn't pass the Hitler test, as I mentioned before we took a break, but there was no Hitler then, so they couldn't have a Hitler test. But they did have another something. Socrates didn't have this something. He was poor. But Callicles wasn't, and I'm sure he had this something, this dark secret of Athens. Slaves. And Socrates is not justifying slavery here. He's just saying, oh, okay, Callicles, so if your slave is stronger than you, it is right if he takes what he can? And obviously, it's easy to see that this right away destroys Callicles' whole argument and requires him to completely change what he's saying. He says, oh, no, I meant the worthier men should take whatever they can. But then he doesn't define worthy, and then he says superior, and then he says wise in the city's affairs and brave, and he keeps changing what he means to kind of hide the fact that he doesn't know what he means, and he doesn't have a clear standard for who should have the right to take whatever he wants, because there is no way to justify that type of philosophy of the taking whatever you want philosophy. Instead of following each and every back and forth regarding that, I just want to bring up a general point here about the logical approach Socrates uses. And this, And this came up a little bit last class, maybe 2 classes ago. the reductio ad absurdum, and again, you don't need this down. Versus a related concern called the slippery slope. But these are very different. The reductio ad absurdum, the reduction to absurdity, as I said last class, is the logical tool you use when you say in a discourse argument, okay, by that logic blank. Something absurd goes in the blank, and that proves that the logic itself is messed up. Okay, Callicles, the strong should take whatever they want, and that is right. So, if your slave is stronger than you, you want him taking whatever he wants? Well, if that doesn't follow, if that's not what you want, then you're going to have to abandon the very same argument that necessarily leads to that absurdity. I should probably close that blind. This is absolutely logically valid. The reductio ad absurdum is a valid logical technique. It disproves anything that it applies to. If you can reduce a given premise to absurdity, in other words, if a given premise necessarily leads to something that is absurd, then that premise itself must be false. It's a very simple technique. It doesn't need this fancy Latin name for you to know what it is and how it works, and that it works. But what's important for our consideration now is to understand that this is not the slippery slope argument. What's the slippery slope argument? I mean, it's an illustration for this kind of concern. The distinction here is important because the reductio ad absurdum, as I said, is a valid argument, completely logically valid. And that's what Socrates uses there. The slippery slope, is that as strong as the reductio ad absurdum? Is the slippery slope argument as strong as the reductio ad absurdum argument? It's not. It is a valid concern, but it's not a valid argument. To continue the analogy, I think it's fair to say, if you're going to walk on a slippery slope, then wear good shoes. Wear shoes with good traction. In other words, if you're going to engage in a certain if you're going to actually move in a certain direction at all, if that's a tempting direction to keep moving in, on and on and on and on, then how about before you even start moving in that direction, set down before you even begin what principles the principles by which you will conclude that you need to stop. How you will know when you've gone too far, so on and so forth. But sometimes you have to walk on a slippery slope. You can't just use this valid concern to not move. You can walk on a slippery slope, but wear good shoes. The walking sometimes must happen. And this is not what Socrates is saying here. He's not using a simple slippery slope concern to refute Callicles. He's using a reductio ad absurdum. So just keep that distinction in mind, not to confuse the two, because they're very much distinct. But I'm not going to test you on that. So moving on here. Callicles reiterates, saying the just is this, for the superior man to have more than the rest, for the rulers to have more than the ruled. Socrates realizes he's not going to get anywhere now with this particular back and forth with Callicles about the superior and the better and the stronger and the worthier, because Callicles clearly has no idea who he's even referring to. So Socrates realizes he needs to bring up another point, the notion of ruling oneself. And this gets to Socrates' second primary doctrine. By the way, the first one, you might have it down already, but if not, you can have down one of Socrates' primary doctrines in this dialogue is it is better to suffer than to commit injustice. The other one now is temperance. It is better to be temperate than a hedonist. I'll just say temperance contra hedonism. So Callicles is all going on and on about how these superior men, these worthier men, these stronger men, whoever the heck they even are, they must rule. They're better, so they must be the ones that rule the inferior. Now Socrates, what about ruling oneself? What about ruling yourself? Callicles says, what are you talking about, ruling himself? Socrates, nothing complicated, but just as the many say, temperate, master of himself, ruling the pleasures and the appetites within him. Callicles responds, how funny you are. You're calling the fools the temperate people. Callicles says, the fine and just according to nature is this, what I'm speaking of freely to you now. The man who is to live rightly should let his appetites grow as large as possible and not restrain them. And when these are as large as possible, he must have the power to serve them, because of his bravery and wisdom, and to fill them with whatever he has an appetite for at any time. But I think this isn't in the power of the many, and they blame these people out of shame, concealing their own powerlessness, and say that intemperance is shameful. And here's where Socrates finally says, wow, Callicles, now you're saying what other people think but aren't willing to say. Socrates is arguing for the basic virtue of temperance, the virtue we all know that we need. We have to be in control of our desires for pleasures. If we can't put the ice cream back when it's time to put it back in the freezer, we're going to be very unhealthy very quickly. Callicles is saying, well, that's ridiculous. The good life is this, having as much pleasure as possible flowing in. It would be absurd to restrain that. It would be folly to restrain that, because that would be like restraining what the good life consists in. So this is hedonism. Okay, so here's Socrates, two primary doctrines, and Callicles would be, well, I just erased it with the one, might makes right, but for completion I'll put it down again. Might makes right, and hedonism. You're carrying through your speech nobly, Callicles, and you're speaking freely. For now you're saying clearly what others think but aren't willing to say. And so I'm asking you not to slacken at all, so that it really will become clear how we should live. This is the most relevant question you could possibly ask. How should we live? What are the principles by which we should live our lives? This is so important. This isn't just some arbitrary philosophical dilemma that they like to debate in some graduate philosophical department somewhere, so they can write a journal article that no one will ever read. I digress. This is about how one ought to live, Socrates is saying. What question could possibly be of more importance than this? All right. Do you say that a man must not restrain his appetites if he is to be as he should be, but should let them grow as great as possible and find fulfillment for them from anywhere at all, and that virtue is this? Socrates is repeating, summarizing Callicles' view even more clearly than he did, to make sure that he's got it right. He's saying, Callicles, is this really what you're saying, that the good life consists in having enormous appetites for pleasures, fulfilling them, whatever they might happen to be, and always having the power to fulfill these appetites? Callicles, that's what I say. All right, so the cards are on the table. And now it's a pivotal exchange. Absolutely pivotal exchange. They both swap accusations for what the life that they're advocating for looks like. So Socrates is advocating for temperance. Callicles is advocating for hedonism. Socrates has an illustration for what Callicles' life looks like, and Callicles has an illustration for what Socrates' life looks like. Callicles said, first of all, Socrates says, so it is wrong to say that those who need nothing are happy? Callicles says, of course, otherwise stones and corpses would be happiest. We've got to pause there. So Callicles says that the life of temperance that Socrates advocates for is like the life of a stone or a corpse. And you got to give him a little credit just because of this one thing. Socrates might have made the mistake in this particular exchange of exalting temperance to be the supreme virtue, when in fact it's just a virtue, not the supreme virtue. Temperance alone is not going to give you a good life. It's just going to enable you to pursue a good life, because lacking temperance will mess things up very quickly. But I should do justice to other viewpoints and say that maybe Socrates was advocating for a radical viewpoint of the more Eastern version, which would say precisely that. Does anyone know what the central tenet of Buddhism is? Well, I guess there's 4. Okay, so it is a way, the Buddha says that he teaches the way to eradicate suffering. And that suffering is the situation that arises when there is a gap between what and what? Desire and fulfillment. You want this, your level of fulfillment is here, you call that gap suffering. So how do we stop suffering then? We've got 2 different things we could do to close that gap. What? Exactly. Usually what we do is the first thing you said. Usually what we do, automatically and understandably, is that when we see a gap here between desire and fulfillment, we try to raise the fulfillment up to the level of desire. In other words, we try to get what we want. But there's another way to close that gap. That's to bring desire down to the level of fulfillment. In other words, try to want what you already have. But what's the problem with that? Buddhism wants to absolutely eradicate all suffering. So fulfillment the level of fulfillment you happen to enjoy at any given moment can always do what? Go down even more. So what's the only, I'm sure you can logically follow this to the next step then, what would Buddhism's answer be to be invincible against all suffering? You got to bring desire down to 0. Because only when it's at 0 can there never be any fulfillment less than it. And that is the teaching of at least Theravada Buddhism, which would be you must absolutely eradicate all desire whatsoever. Because to desire anything is a source of suffering. And I don't think that's what Socrates intends to advocate for here. I think he just didn't state his position very well and failed to refute Callicles' response. The life of Socrates does not exactly look like the life of a stone or a corpse if you look at some of the biographical details of his life. I can't have a hard time thinking of anybody's life who looks less like the life of a stone or a corpse. Socrates' point is simply that we mustn't let the lower desires rule the higher ones. That it is good to have desire, but we should desire what is good and true and wise and noble and beautiful, and that we should dedicate our lives to pursuing these things, not to pursuing comfort and pleasure and money and safety and security and popularity. Those are the lower desires. Those are the desires that we wake up in the morning by default wanting. But they're rather unfulfilling. And yet they force themselves upon us by just automatically. I don't know of anybody, I don't know, but my job is to philosophize, and I don't exactly wake up in the morning when my alarm goes off just philosophizing and desiring wisdom. I desire, when I wake up in the morning, I want like ice cream or something, unfortunately. But it's these lower desires that more zealously force themselves upon us. Therefore, if we are to pursue the higher desires with our life and the greater ends, we have to have what to even enable that pursuit? Temperance. Otherwise, the lower desires will rule because they're more prevalent. They force themselves upon us by themselves. More on this in the Plato unit. He's got a great allegory for this. But anyway, Callicles jumps on this because, frankly, Socrates didn't state what I just said there very well. And it took until Aristotle to give a much more wholesome view of the nature of bodily goods and pleasures, a much more balanced view, I should say. But still, Socrates, I think it's safe to say, is not advocating for what he's implying accidentally here by saying that those who are happy are those who need nothing. Rather, happiness requires temperance, is all he really means to say. All right, so Callicles says the life Socrates is advocating for looks like the life of a stone or a corpse. But Socrates says that the life that Callicles is advocating for is like what? What image? Does anyone recall what image Socrates uses? It's like a leaking jar. He says, suppose, for instance, that each of two men has a lot of jars, and one has sound and full jars, sound meaning in good shape, one full of wine, one of honey, another of milk, and many others full of many things. And suppose that the sources for each of these things are scarce and hard to find, provided only with much severe effort. Now when one man is filled up, he brings in no more, and doesn't care about them, but is at rest as far as they are concerned. The other man has sources like the first man's that can be drawn on, though with difficulty, but his vessels are leaky and rotten, and he is forced to be always filling them day and night, or else he suffers the most extreme distresses. Now, if this is how each man's life is, do you say that the intemperate man's life is happier than the orderly man's? When I tell you this, do I persuade you at all to concede that the orderly life is better than the intemperate, or don't I persuade you? Callicles, no, you don't, Socrates. For the one who has filled up his jar no longer has any pleasure anymore. It's what I was saying just now, living like a stone once he is filled up, with no more enjoyment or distress. No, living pleasantly is in this, having as much as possible flowing in. Socrates, but if the inflow is large, mustn't the outflow be large too? And mustn't there be big holes for the outflow? Callicles says, of course. So Socrates' own illustration didn't work with Callicles. Socrates says, Callicles, the life you're advocating for looks like a leaky jar. And Callicles says, that's awesome. I want my jar to be leaking. Why? The more my jar leaks, the more I can pour more pleasure in. He's really going all out. He's really following the premises to their logical extreme, which again, very few people are willing to do openly, at least in dialogue. They do in practice often. So the problem is Callicles is right if pleasure is the good. So this is the next major question they have to address. Is pleasure the good, and conversely, is pain the bad? The example here of having pleasures constantly, you want a jar full of holes if the good life consists in having as much being poured in. Because once the jar is full, you can't keep pouring in if it's not flowing out at the same rate. And that's actually precisely the problem with pleasure, one of them. I hate to have to bring up a gross example, but some of you have probably heard it already. Ancient Greece, Rome. What the most accessible pleasure any time is always eating. What's the problem with the pleasure of eating? At some point you what? Run out of food. There's a real big problem. Even before you run out of food, you run out of space to put it in. You get full. Well, what would they do? Well, drink. Yeah, there's another. Saturate the food already in there. The alcohol. There you go. They would certainly do that. But they would also just keep eating in their vomitoriums. Pass the bucket around, throw up in the bucket, and keep eating. It's disgusting, but this is exactly what extreme hedonism leads to. These measures, whatever it takes to pile in more pleasure. And I don't know of any vomitoriums around here, but I do know many addicts who live similar lives. So, what does this do if lived out? Well, this doesn't take much philosophizing to refute. People who try to live this life very soon see how self-defeating it is. Or I should say most people. Most people, if they pursue hedonism outright, they'll be in Skid Row in short order, they'll hit rock bottom, and they'll learn their lesson, as we said in the beginning of this discussion, the hard way. But some people don't hit rock bottom too quickly because they have all the means of avoiding it. They've got the power, the money, the looks, the fame. Who am I talking about? Celebrities, exactly. The ultimate Calliclean lifestyle. Not so much of the taken from the weak part, but the hedonism part. And I'm not saying all celebrities. I do not intend to condemn any demographic. But it's worth noting that the life Callicles is advocating for right here, in these paragraphs, is like the life of a celebrity socialite. The few who have all of these desires for pleasures and they're always fulfilling them, they always have the power to fulfill them. And it's a fitting example to bring up because although hedonism will wreak havoc more quickly in the lives of most than of those who can afford to avoid that havoc for a while, it's also undeniable that celebrities are by far the most depressed, suicidal, drug-addicted, anxiety-ridden demographic in the entire world. For some reason, we want to be like them. It's insanity. But anyway, you can see the value of a philosophy in its fruits. So, clearly, we can just look at those who live this and see that there's a problem with it, but that's not enough. If we want to philosophize about something, we really need to address it as carefully as we can logically. So that's what Socrates is going to try to do next. He realizes now that his example didn't work because if pleasure is the good, Callicles is right. Again, you want the holes in the jar if pleasure is the good. So Socrates has got to try and show that pleasure is not the good, but the good itself is something else. It's not pleasure. And that conversely, the bad is not pain. The good being, if the good were pleasure, then by definition, the good life would be the life above all directed at the good, namely hedonism. All right, so why isn't pleasure the good, according to Socrates? Well, he brings up a strange example, but that actually works okay, about eating. How does Socrates show that pleasure is not simply equal to the good? Well, when you're eating, are you in pleasure or pain, according to Socrates? Trick question. It's what? Both. Because when you're eating, are you hungry or satiated? Hungry and being satiated. So you have the pain, when you're eating, you have the pain of hunger and the satisfaction of receiving the food, which is the opposite of hunger, and yet they're both coexisting at the same time for the same reason, and they stop at the same time for the same reason, namely when you're full. When you're full, the pleasure of eating stops and the pain of hunger stops. So in other words, they're not just accidentally simultaneous phenomena. They're actually causally linked realities. Hunger and satiation. Causally linked through this eating process. Now, things that are opposites cannot exist, contradictory opposites cannot exist at the same time for the same reason. And yet, by definition, the good and the bad are complete contradictory opposites. That's just definitional. So, what follows from this? Well, if pleasure and pain, at least in the case of eating and probably in plenty of other cases as well, coexist within your soul, within your psyche, your mind, your body, whatever, if they coexist, in other words, if they are being experienced at the same time for the same reason, how could they be identified? How could they themselves be absolute opposites? They must not be, Socrates is saying. Let me give you something easier to put down for your notes. Pleasure and pain are simultaneous and causally linked. These are not the exact words Socrates uses. I'm trying to cram a few pages into one sentence here. Are causally linked, thus they cannot be opposites. Which the good and the bad are. Okay, so that's an interesting example. I don't know how bulletproof it is, but it's worth considering. There's another better example, and I don't want to mine through the dialogue to try to find it. But he brings up also the fact that pleasure and pain cannot be the good and the bad respectively, because often we deliberately and rightly cause pain for the sake of the good. And we all know that. No pain, no gain. No pain, no gain. It's true. You know, if you're working out and you've worked out so pathetically that you're not even a little bit tired or feeling exertion or sore or anything, it was probably a pretty useless workout. We intentionally this is not to say we should be sadistic or masochistic, of course not. The point is we often rightly, deliberately inflict pain for the sake of the good. Not because we like pain, not because pain is the good, but because it's necessary often to inflict for the sake of the good. You know, I doubt any of us really wanted to get out of bed this morning, but whatever we had to do this morning was good enough to be worth the pain of getting out of bed. When justice is served, when a criminal is punished, is caught and punished, and the punishment meets the crime, and the criminal accepts it, and do we say that is good that happened, or that is bad that happened? And it's not good that the criminal did what he did, but it's good that justice has been served. You know, it's good that the guilty party has been caught and convicted. We rightly say that is a good. It's good that happened. It's good that this person is being brought to justice, assuming it's not a too overly severe punishment. And yet, that is quite clearly the inflicting of pain upon a person. How on earth can we say that pleasure is the good and pain is the bad if we inflict pain for the sake of the good? No, we can't. You know, it'd be like, think of a game of basketball. The good of a game of basketball is having more points than the opposing team once the clock runs out. That is the good of basketball. So you would never do something completely contradictory to that in a basketball game. You would never, kind of just spur of the moment bringing this up here. Let's see if it'll work. You would never deliberately miss a shot in a basketball game, because that would be completely diametrically opposed to the good of the basketball game. There are individual goods that you often do withhold. You know, dribbling is a good thing in basketball. Passing is a good thing in basketball. But there are often times where you must withhold from dribbling or passing, like if you're in a good position to take a shot. And yet, dribbling are good. So similarly, pleasure is a good, but if pleasure were the good, then it would be impossible to ever forego it for the sake of the good, because that would be contradictory. So in other words, we all know that pleasure is not the good by the mere fact that we often deliberately withhold it for the sake of the good. Hedonism refutes itself almost as quickly as relativism refutes itself, although not as quickly. All right, so what can we say about that? Well, the good itself often requires inflicting pain or avoiding pleasure. The good, this is his second way of showing, and we can have that down to the same question here. The good itself often requires inflicting pain or withholding pleasure. And you might say, well, hold on, in a basketball game you often have to not take a shot because it would make more sense to pass or dribble. To which I respond, yes, indeed, but not if you somehow knew that taking the shot would go in. Especially if it was a three-pointer. Like if you somehow, and obviously we can't know this, but just to continue the analogy, if you somehow knew that a given shot would be, you'd make it in, there would be no conceivable scenario where you wouldn't take the shot, because that is the good of basketball. you would never withhold from the good for the sake of the good. And yet we do withhold from pleasure for the sake of the good. We all do it every day. Therefore, we must logically conclude that even if pleasure is a good, and indeed it is a good, pleasure is a good, but it is not the good. We know it's not the good. And that means we have to try and find out what the good is. What is the good? Well, this is the central question that existence itself foists upon all of us. It's another way of saying what's the meaning of life. What is the good to which we must direct our lives? Well, Socrates says here, and he doesn't have a complete answer to that question. I mean, I don't know if anyone does. But there are many good answers to it. And Socrates has a few things to say here. For the sake of the god of friendship, Callicles, don't think that you should make jokes of me, and don't answer capriciously, contrary to what you think. Nor again take what I say that way, as making jokes. For you see that our discussion is about this. And what would anyone with the slightest intelligence be more seriously concerned about than this? I mean, the way we ought to live. He's saying, don't make jokes at the expense of the good, at the expense of the way we ought to live. Socrates would not be a fan of the typical modern sitcom, which does precisely that every couple minutes. He's going to say, he says next, the good man who speaks with a view to the best, he won't speak at random, but he will look to something. He will be like all other craftsmen. Each of them selects and applies his efforts with a view to his own work, not at random, but so that what he produces will acquire some form. Look, for instance, if you like, at the painters, the builders, the shipwrights, all other craftsmen. Whichever one you like, see how each of them arranges in a structure, whatever he arranges, and compels one thing to be fitting and suitable to another, until he composes the whole thing arranged in a structure and order. All craftsmen, including those we were talking about just now, gymnastics trainers, doctors, from the body into order and they put the body into order and structure, don't they? Do we agree about this? Callicles says, okay, we'll grant that. And when the house gets the structure in order, it will be worthy, and when it lacks the structure, wretched. Agreed, Callicles says. The same way with a boat? Yes. The same way with our bodies? Yes. Socrates says, what about the soul? Will it be worthy if it lacks structure, or if it gains some kind of structure and order? The structures and orderings of the soul, for the name of this is law, lawfulness, from which people become lawful and orderly, and these are justice and temperance. All right. He's bringing up the example of a craftsman. Any undertaking of any sort, for it to be at all coherent, it's a major philosophical principle here. It must always have one end in mind. Not two, not three, certainly not more. One. If it doesn't have one end in mind, there is nothing to give that undertaking any coherence throughout time. And we all know this. If you wake up one day and you really want to get working on a project, but on the same project, one day you decide you're going to work on a boat, the next day you're working on a car, the next day you want this project to be a house, the next day you're working on a chair, what's this thing going to look like after a certain amount of time? It's going to look like a pile of garbage. It's going to be a waste of time because that whole project had no coherence. Instead, and I'm not saying you can't tweak along the way, of course you can, but you still have one end, you still have one objective in mind when you engage in anything. If you don't have one objective in mind, it's like you're running on a treadmill. You don't even know what you're doing. One day you might be working against the very thing you did the day before. The next day, you might be working against the very thing you'll do a week from now. And you might as well have just stayed in bed that whole time. So, if we all know that it's that way with any individual project we work on, we always have something we specifically want to build, something we want to achieve, something that we want to, some end that we're directing our efforts to. If it's that way with projects and with skills and with crafts, as Socrates says, in painting and shipbuilding and whatever else, what about our life? Doesn't our life also need the same thing? If we're dedicating our lives to one end, one day, month, year, and another one the next, and still another one the year after that. We're just going to wake up one day and realize that we've achieved nothing of meaning because there was no coherence to our efforts. There was no overarching end to direct the various different undertakings that we had to do. What is that one end? Well, Socrates is giving us some good hints at it. Aristotle is going to give some much better hints at it later. I don't think any of them figured it out. I'm not saying I have it here figured out, but that's the overarching question in philosophy. It's a quintessential thing that you'll hear anybody ask if they want to ask a meaningful question, the meaning of life. There's nothing merely scholarly or academic about this. This is the central question that existence foists upon all of us. And even if we're not going to answer it completely in this class, and even if Socrates is not going to answer it in this dialogue, at the minimum, we can at least start with what? You have a multiple choice question and a quiz, and you have no idea what the answer is, you begin by at least doing what? Elimination. Process of elimination. There's nothing wrong with that. The minimum, we can begin with process of elimination. In fact, I always try to make my quiz questions that way, so that even if you don't remember a detail from a dialogue, if you at least kind of remember the gist of the arguments, you'll be able to eliminate all but one answer. So in this case, Socrates is not giving the meaning of life. He's not giving the end towards which all actions must be directed. He's giving some clues about it, but most importantly in this dialogue is the process of elimination. What Socrates is saying it does not consist in, and that's pleasure. The good is not pleasure. It is a good, but it is not the good. Therefore, whatever goods are higher than it must never be contradicted by our desire for it. Okay. At this point, Socrates has gotten so clear about the argument, and frankly, so irrefutable with it, that Callicles says, I don't know what you're saying, Socrates. Ask someone else. So he says, there's no one else to ask. He already talked to Gorgias and Polus, and no one else is around. So Callicles says, all right, can you finish the discussion yourself? Say it all in your own person and answer your own questions. So Socrates obliges, and he does exactly that. I'm not going to go through it because he's really summarizing what we've already talked about, but I will skip ahead here and read a couple quotes from Socrates' description of what someone's life would look like who's not living this life of a jar filled with holes. What someone's life would at least start to look like who's trying to pursue justice. And so Callicles, since the tempered man is just and brave and pious, as we described him, he definitely must be a completely good man. And the good man must do whatever he does well and finely, and the man who does well must be blessed and happy. And the base man who does badly will be wretched. And this would be the man who is the opposite way to the temperate man, that is, the intemperate man whom you, Callicles, were praising. And so I set things down this way and say that these things are true. And if they are true, then apparently the man who wants to be happy must pursue and practice temperance and flee intemperance as fast as each of us can run. This is the goal that a man should look to in living, on which he should concentrate everything of his own and the city's, to see that justice and temperance are present in everyone. He should not allow his appetites to be intemperate and try to fulfill them, an endless evil, while he lives the life of a brigand. For no other man would be a friend to such a man, nor would God. For he is incapable of community. And when there is no community with a man, there can be no friendship with him. Now there's a point. We're going to see later in the course with the Aristotle unit just how absolutely necessary friendship is for all of us. You can't really be friends with a hedonist. Because if all a hedonist wants is pleasure, how does he even know how to approach friendship? He doesn't. And that's what Socrates is pointing out here. One who has no temperance, it's impossible to have true friendship with him. Okay. Well then, he says, either we must refute this argument and show that it is not by possession of justice and temperance that the happy are happy, and that the wretched are not wretched by the possession of vice, or else, if this argument is true, we must examine what are the results that follow. So let's consider what you're abusing me for, Callicles, whether it's well said or not. You say indeed that I am unable to help myself or any of my friends or relatives, or to save them from the most serious dangers, but that I'm in the power of whoever wishes, just as the dishonored are at the mercy of whoever feels like it. Whether he wants to push my face in your vigorous expression, or to confiscate my money, or to expel me from the city, or finally to kill me. And this condition is the most shameful of all on your account. Now, what my argument is often enough been said already, but nothing prevents it being said over again. I say, Callicles, that having my face pushed in unjustly is not the most shameful thing, nor is having my body or my purse cut. But to strike and to cut me and mine unjustly is more shameful and evil. Socrates took his time to respond to this. Much earlier in the dialogue, Callicles is mocking Socrates, saying his philosophy won't save him. Callicles is very proud of the fact that with his rhetoric and his sophistry, he thinks he can get himself out of anything. Just think about the arrogance with which some high-powered lawyer might go about his affairs, thinking he can get himself out of any charge. That's kind of how Callicles is strutting about. And he's mocking Socrates because Socrates is concerned only with the truth, and being concerned only with the truth might not even get you vindicated, even if you are innocent. Because, it's not necessarily concerned above all with persuasion. So Socrates is saying, Callicles, so what? I don't care. I'm not in this to save my hide. I didn't sit down and dream up what the safest career path would be for me to follow and thus commence philosophizing. It is a straw man to accuse me of being open to whoever wants to abuse me. A straw man is an irrelevant argument. Socrates never said that he could defend himself successfully if he was charged with something. And obviously, this is quite prophetic. This probably transpired a couple decades before his trial. And yet we see, I admit, Plato probably wrote it afterwards, but still, we could see some prophetic elements in this, even if you want to argue that Plato just put it in there afterwards, whatever. He says, what lack of power to defend himself would make a man really ridiculous? Won't it be the lack of power to defend himself against the greatest of harms to us? And here's where he gets into tying it back into the beginning, where he had said that the rhetors have the least power. I'm not going to go over it all again because I said enough earlier, but he's saying again that the rhetors have the least power because they have no defense against the greatest evil of committing injustice, namely. All right. So, although Socrates is more than willing to admit that he does not have the power to defend himself necessarily against unjust accusations, this is completely irrelevant, as I said, a straw man, because Socrates is already absolutely convinced, and I dare say rightfully so, of his own invincibility. He's like a one-man Justice League. Why is Socrates invincible? Well, you could say he's not, because they killed him, as you guys know since you read the Apology. Well, they didn't kill him then, but they condemned him to death then. That's not a mark against his invincibility. Socrates just spent all these pages, or I should say hours, because he was speaking this, proving that the only real evil, the only real harm to someone is to commit an injustice. Socrates has set his face like flint to be absolutely dead set, to be sure that he will never, what? Commit an injustice. All right. You can't just wake up one morning and decide you're never going to commit an injustice. Please try, but we might very well fail many times. I know I do. But Socrates was so dedicated to this year after year. There does come a time when you're so dedicated to something like that for so long that you no longer have any fear of the future whatsoever. He knows for sure that he'll never commit an injustice, and it's that simple. Since he does know that, since he knows that nothing will ever sway him from the path of justice, and since he's just proven that the only harm is committing an injustice, it is not that much of a stretch to say Socrates is invincible. And even if you don't buy that, and I know that's kind of maybe allegorical, but whatever your take is on that, what can't be denied is that Socrates believes it. Socrates is convinced of his own invincibility. So he has absolutely no fear, and there's absolutely no grounds for Callicles' attacks that he can't save himself, because he doesn't care. He's not in it to save himself. So he sums it up by saying to Callicles, "Don't tell me what you've often told me, that anyone who wants to will kill me. Save me the trouble of telling you in reply. He'll be a base, and I'll be a good man. And don't tell me he'll take away anything I have, or I'll reply, when he takes it, he'll have no good use for it. He took it from me unjustly, and in the same way he's taken it, he'll use it unjustly. And if unjustly, then shamefully, and if shamefully, then badly." Callicles responds to this, "How confident you seem that none of these things will ever happen to you, Socrates. You think you live out of harm's way, and that you'll never be dragged into court, perhaps by some wretched scoundrel." Well, that's ironic. It's exactly what happened a couple decades later. Callicles is accusing Socrates of thinking he's living out of harm's way. Obviously, Socrates is living quite in harm's way. He is angering all of the most powerful people in Athens by reproving them and reproaching them for their immorality and their error. He is a gadfly. He is constant, as you saw in the Apology, he is constantly aggravating people. He knows full well that he's up against the most powerful people that can put him to death. In fact, it even says there in the Apology that they tried to put him to death once, many years before his actual trial, but they failed because the government was overturned and the people that wanted to kill him were no longer in power. He stood up for the truth when they wanted to execute all these generals who understandably fled from this dangerous situation without having time to recover the bodies of the soldiers who died. The Athenians were so outraged at that they wanted to execute all these generals. And Socrates says, no, that's unjust. He was the only one who argued against the execution. And he so ruffled feathers then that they wanted to kill Socrates then. But they didn't get a chance to, because again, they fell out of power. So Socrates knows full well that he doesn't live out of harm's way. He's not an armchair. He's anything but an armchair critic. He's not some guy in social media that never actually takes any risks but just has a lot of criticisms to offer. That is, he is on the front lines in the truest sense of the word. But Callicles doesn't believe that now. I don't know if Callicles was around for the trial. Socrates says, if I was put on trial, he gives an analogy for what that would look like. He says, I will be judged as a doctor might be judged by a jury of children with a cook as a prosecutor. What does that analogy mean? I will be judged as a doctor might be judged by a jury of children with a cook as a prosecutor. It's kind of a lot of stuff packed into the analogy. It's kind of hard to piece apart. But
Is he saying like they don't know what they're talking about?
absolutely. If a doctor was put on trial by a jury of children, the children don't like the doctor. Why? Yucky medicine, shots. It's not fun to go to the doctor. But the doctor is trying to do what's best for the child. But who does the child think does what's best for him? The cook or the doctor? The cook, the pastry baker in other translations. So if a pastry baker were the prosecuting lawyer, pointing at the doctor there on trial with a jury of children behind him, it would be quite clear what would happen. And in fact, Socrates gives a couple lines in there. Children, this man has inflicted many evils upon you. He ruins the youngest of you by cutting and burning. He leaves you confused, slimming, I don't know what that means, and choking you, giving you these terribly bitter potions and compelling you to go hungry and thirsty. He's not like me. I used to feast you on many pleasant things of all kinds. I used to give you cookies and candies. It would be very easy, Socrates' point is, it would be very easy for a cook as a prosecutor to get a doctor condemned if the jury was a bunch of children. Because the children know what pleases the taste buds, and that's fine for children, it's just an analogy. Well, Socrates is saying, my judges, the people of Athens, would Be just like those children. And the prosecutor, the cook, that would be the sophist, the rhetor, who speaks only to please, only to tickle earbuds, only to flatter people. He knows, and he would know exactly what to say about Socrates, who speaks only for the sake of the good, only because he wants to make people as good as possible, only because he wants to find the truth. And what is good and right and true doesn't always, in fact, doesn't usually sound as pretty and fun and nice as what is flattery, as what comes from the mouth of the sophists. So it's a very fitting analogy. And reading the Apology, you can see just how well that analogy works. But he's about to end this off here. He says, but if I died because I lacked flattering rhetoric, I know for sure that you would see me bearing death easily. For being put to death itself, no one fears that, unless he's altogether unreasoning and unmanly. He's throwing Callicles' own criticism back in his face. We recall, no doubt from pages ago, Callicles saying that Socrates' philosophy was unmanly. Well, now Socrates is saying, actually, Callicles, what's unmanly is being afraid of death. For being put to death itself, no one fears that, unless he's altogether unreasoning and unmanly. It is doing injustice that he fears. For if the soul is full of many injustices when it arrives in Hades, that is the ultimate of all evils. I only know of this. I don't know of any other instances in the whole Platonic corpus where Socrates refers to something as the ultimate of all evils, except for this quote right here. Doing injustice, committing injustice is the only real evil, but the ultimate evil is to die in that state of soul, of being one who commits injustices. And that is it for Gorgias' dialogue.